Imagine going on a trip to explore a land that you have never been to before. You might not know the animals that you'll encounter, you probably won't know the people either, and you might find yourself getting lost easily. This is how Lewis and Clark found themselves when they set out to explore new territory. But they didn't do it alone. They had a guide, and her name was Sacagawea. She helps them to navigate the unfamiliar land. She helped them to communicate with the indigenous people. And they wouldn't have been able to be as successful on their journey without someone to faithfully guide them every step of the way. When the group reached the Bitterroot Mountains, Sacagawea helped them identify edible plants and find safe passages. Lewis and Clark had to rely on her to help them pass through the unfamiliar terrain. The idea of trusting a navigator with greater knowledge than oneself is similar to where Gideon found himself in Judges chapter 6, 7, and 8. God was faithful to his people, and he stayed by their side, just as Sacagawea did for Lewis and Clark. God also instructed Gideon in his greater plan, just as Sacagawea did as well. The story of Gideon is where we are going to explore today. The story of Gideon is found in the midst of the book of Judges. And throughout the book of Judges, we see a cycle. The Israelites, God's people, sin, and as a result, they suffer, and then they cry out to God because of their suffering, and then he delivers them. He raises up a judge. And it's in the midst of this suffering and crying out portion that we are in this story, the beginning of this story. See, the Israelites were being oppressed by the Midianites. The Midianites would tear apart their crops and destroy their food and made the Israelites poor. And so they cried out to God. Gideon, here in Judges, was secretly threshing wheat in a winepress in efforts to hide from the Midianites. Soon, Gideon is not alone. An angel of the Lord appears to him, and he says, "Mighty warrior, God is with you." And Gideon probably heard mighty warrior and was skeptical, because how could God be with them when the Midianites were tearing apart their crops and ruining their lives? And the title of mighty warrior certainly wouldn't fit Gideon, because his clan was the weakest and he was the least in his family. And so Gideon replied, he asked, well, but how is this so? How can the Lord be with us when all these things are happening? But God answered in return. See, he replied to Gideon, to go in the strength that you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. This second assurance was still not enough for Gideon, and he asked, how is this possible? How can I save Israel? The third time, the Lord assures Gideon that he is with him. We see God's fingerprint of faithfulness through his intercession in the Israelites' hardship, but we also see it in God's replies to Gideon. Even in Gideon's doubts and weaknesses, God's fingerprint of faithfulness was still present through his three assurances and sending the angel. God invited Gideon to trust and be faithful to his greater plan. Before Gideon fully trusts God's plan, he asks for a sign. He places meat and broth before the angel and watches as the angel lights it on fire with the tip of his staff. He finally realizes just who he's talking to, and he does the only thing appropriate in the moment, which is build an altar to the Lord. The next morning, we see God requiring obedience from Gideon as he tells him to go and tear down the altars of Baal and the Asherah pole. Gideon does so by night, but he still acted in obedience to the faithful God. Continually, God's faithfulness to his people is evident, but we also see that he requires this obedience. It's not enough that Gideon be told what God is going to do, but he act faithfully according to it. He did so fearfully, but nonetheless, we see Gideon's faithfulness through his obedience. One final sign is requested by Gideon. See, the assurances of mighty warrior and that the Lord would be with him and were not enough for him. And he asked for God to give him another sign. This time he asked that he place the fleece on the ground. And if in the morning the fleece is wet and the ground is dry, then he would trust God. Gideon did not want to follow through with this plan. And he was probably hoping that in the morning he would show up and God would not deliver on the sign. That way, he would not have to be the mighty warrior and not have to deliver God. But sure enough, he shows up in the morning. The fleece is wet, the ground is dry. So he has another idea. He'll ask God to reverse it. And God did so. The next morning, the fleece was dry and the ground was wet. And God showed that he would be with Gideon. God is faithful in assuring all Gideon's questions and leaving Gideon no room to doubt. Soon it became time for God to demonstrate both his faithfulness and his greatness once more. It was time to assemble the army. And so Gideon gathered up all the men, and just as God directed, and there were 32,000 of them there. And God said, 32,000 is too many for me. Send the fearful ones home. And 22,000 left. Here Gideon was, being faithful to God, supposed to defeat the Midianites with a measly army of 10,000. Except it wasn't going to be a measly army of 10,000 because God wanted to shrink the army even further. And so this time we see God tell Gideon to take the people to the stream and have the people drink. This probably would have seemed very odd to Gideon, but he obeyed God's instructions, and the people went to the stream and drank. But then there was another instruction. All the people who scooped the water with their hands when they drank would be part of the army. But the ones who lapped the water like dogs were to go home. Gideon probably was hoping that there was tons of people that scooped the water up. He needed a big army to defeat the Midianites. Except he didn't, because God is powerful and greater and would deliver his people. And only 300 of the men were left. And so the Israelites did not need to rely on the strength of men. They only needed to rely and trust in the strength of God. Now is the time. The story had led up to this very moment. First, God assured Gideon that he chose him. Then he assured him that he would be faithful to him and be with him. Then God's fingerprint of faithfulness was evident in showing Gideon that he did not need a large army. He compelled him to trust his power to faithfully deliver. Now is the time to prove his power, to show his might and faithfully deliver the Israelites from their oppressors once again. It was time for battle. The Israelites all assumed their positions around the Midianite camp, and they were emboldened by a dream that the Midianites people had. See, God told Gideon to go down and listen to their conversation. And when he did, he heard that they had a dream that meant that God was going to defeat them, the Midianites. And so emboldened and strengthened by this dream, the 300 men were ready for battle. God does not have to win battles with conventional methods of weapons and swords. He won the battle in a different way. He had them blow trumpets. He had them break jars and hold up torches. And he had them shout, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." And so the Israelites did as they were instructed by God. They broke the jars. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." And God made the Midianites so fearful that they turned on each other and defeated themselves. And so Gideon went, chased after their leaders, and they defeated the Midianites with God's help and God's power. The Israelites faithfully obeyed God's commands, and he again showed his faithfulness by delivering them. Unfortunately, the story of Gideon does not end there in the high of the battle and in perfect victory. The Israelites asked him to be their king, and he declined. He made the right decision. But later on, he made an ephod idol that was a snare to him and his family. Not all moments are heroic and grand and perfect for believers, even ones chosen by God. Sometimes God's people are disobedient and follow their own ways instead of God. However, throughout this story, we see God's faithfulness to his people. God called Gideon, an unlikely hero, to obey, and God delivered on his promise to deliver the Israelites from the hand of the Midianites. The story of Gideon highlights God's faithfulness and his call for people to remain faithful in obedience to him. And from this story, we can learn to follow God's lead. Follow God's lead is what Gideon did and the Israelites did in this story. The Israelites needed to trust God's way instead of their own. There are two parts to following God's lead. The first is God's part, and the second is ours. First, God shows his faithfulness. And we see him showing his faithfulness to the Israelites all throughout the Old Testament and time again in the story of Gideon. And the second part is we act in obedience. We choose to follow his plan and to obey his commands. Again, first, God shows his faithfulness, and second, we act in obedience. Let's look at how God shows his faithfulness in Gideon's story. Throughout the cycle of Judges, God was faithful to his people by delivering them even when they turned against him. We also see God showing his faithfulness by having Gideon to come and to help deliver the Israelites out of the hand of the Midianites. And he even assured Gideon by giving him signs. And again, at the very end of the story, God shows his faithfulness by bringing victory to the Israelites. When God chose Gideon, he saw a man who was weak, but a man who could be strong and lead the army. Just like there's plenty of evidence of faithfulness in the Bible, we can see evidence of faithfulness and what it means to be faithful in real life. One example is a famous geyser named Old Faithful. This geyser was named for its consistent and predictable eruptions. And this was a long time ago when they first discovered the geyser. They noticed that it would erupt very consistently, an average of every 90 minutes. You could depend on it and count on it to do so. And that's where it gets the name Old Faithful. And people come from all over to visit this very famous, perhaps the most famous geyser. Just like how we know that the geyser will faithfully erupt within a certain time frame, so we can trust God to be faithful and consistent and do what he tells us to do and to also do to be part of our lives and to care about us and his people. But the question is, how can we know God's faithfulness? How do we live this out in our life? There are a few ways in which we can do so. The first is to fill your map and give God credit. And what I mean by that is, just as I marked key points in Gideon's story where God was with him and was faithful, so our lives also are a journey in which we can mark key points where God is faithful to us. And we can write those down and remember them even in our doubts and uncertainties and when we don't feel like a mighty warrior. There are a few other ways in which we can see God show his faithfulness and apply that to our lives. One of the ways is to trust God to be faithful in his way and not yours. God shrank Gideon's army to 300, which didn't make any sense. But Gideon had to trust and know that God was going to be faithful in those moments. And so in our lives, when we have moments that don't quite make sense, we can remember that God is still faithful, and we can trust God to work out his plan his way, not our plan our way. And finally, we can know that in weakness, he's still faithful. There are going to be times where we doubt ourselves or doubt our ability to carry out the pieces of God's plan. But we can know that God is still faithful in those moments, that he can use us, and that we can also be a tool and use our gifts for him and his kingdom. Again, we know that God shows his faithfulness in our past and in our future. The second thing that we need to remember is that we act in obedience. God does his part by acting faithfully, but we must do our part by acting in obedience. Again, we act in obedience. In Gideon's life, we see examples of obedience, even though he did so reluctantly at times. At the beginning, we see Gideon waver. God sent the angel and he doubted 3 times. He said, I'm not a mighty warrior. How's the Lord with us? He didn't always trust. But as the story goes on, we see those moments where Gideon did obey God. Gideon built an altar to God to respond to his presence, and he also obeyed God when God said to tear one down. He obeyed unusual directions, and though it would have been difficult to trust that God would use the 300 men, he still obeyed and still carried out the Lord's commands in that area. And then we see his obedience in the battle, and that his obedience and God's power and might brought about victory. Obeying did not always make sense. You had to tear down the idols to be fully committed and obedient to God. But obedience is necessary. One of the ways in which we can see obedience is in our life, and I have seen obedience in my life specifically. Part of my path, there's several key aspects. How I switched to a Christian school, got to Central, those are parts of it. But one piece of my path in which I had to obey God directly was when God directed me to change my major. See, I came to Bible college with the plan to double major because I knew that God wanted me to do ministry, but I didn't fully trust that I would make enough money. I wasn't fully committed to, well, what if this doesn't work out? What if I can't find the job? And so I came double majoring in an early childhood ed degree and religious studies. But throughout my time here, the Holy Spirit worked on my life, and I began to realize that was just a safety net that I was trying to set up for myself. And that was my plan for my life, my way, and not God's plan and his way. And so I sat on the couch at my house, and my family calls it my thinking spot, and I made a big decision to change my major. And I told my parents, I said, I know that this is what God wants me to do, and who am I to choose to do something else? And so just as I needed to obey in that moment and in that part of my life, so we all also have moments, and I know you all do, where you need to obey God. Maybe, and you'll see those moments and be faithful to him in them. There's some practical ways in which we can live out this obedience. We can evaluate the areas of our life that we're fighting for control, like I was in my future, and we can surrender those to God. We can use our map and look at the ways God was faithful in the past in order to be emboldened and step out in obedience, knowing that he'll be faithful in our present and our future. You can journal, write down, the struggles, what you weren't sure of, what you're doubting, or how God was good to you, and use those also as you work through what it means to be obedient. And finally, I have tear down idols, because in the story of Gideon, we saw that part of the oppression was from when they weren't obeying God. They were worshiping idols, turning their own way. And in our life, there are times that we have worldly things holding us back. Social media, addiction, crude language, what you watch and listen to, and friends are just a few that could be holding you back in obedience. But ultimately, you have to discover those things for yourself and tear down those idols and be obedient to God. We must follow God's lead. We can follow God's lead by knowing that God does demonstrate his faithfulness, and follow God's lead by acting in obedience. Maybe you've been feeling inadequate and inequipped for what God has called you to do. You can trust your giftings and follow God's lead. Maybe you've been experiencing a trial so great that it doesn't feel as though God is in it. Follow God's lead. Maybe you're doubting what God will or can do. Trust his faithfulness and follow his lead. Maybe you're confused about your future or your next steps or aren't sure. Be patient, draw near to God, trust, and follow his lead. There have been times in the past or present, and there will be times in the future where you must remember that God has and will continue to demonstrate his faithfulness in your life, and you must act in obedience. Follow God's lead, because no matter what, his fingerprints of faithfulness will continue to be on your life. Thank you.